To have you here, Chip. Tell me, look, a man with experience of command, President Volodymyr Zelensky has now been named Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Can you give us your appraisal of the role and the importance of Volodymyr Zelensky as the pinnacle of power in Ukraine and the Ukrainian military?
Well, in terms of leadership, the quote that I always like is the one from Montgomery, who said that leadership is the capacity and will to rally men and women to a common purpose and the character which inspires confidence. And Zelensky has done that throughout in three vectors. And the vectors of leadership which we look at are always really there under times of stress, and that is character, competence, and communication. And character often means more than competence when things are really, really bad. And things were really, really bad. And it's worth remembering that the Times Man of the Year in 1940 was Churchill. And he was the Man of the Year because he was deemed to be a larger than life figure who pronounced dreams of victory when all seemed lost. And that is what
Yes.
Zelensky has been able to do. It's often worth recalling that he talked to the Houses of Parliament on the 13th day of the war when all the successes they've had since the winning the battles of Kiev and Kharkiv and Kherson were not there. They were on the back foot. But he was that great communicator who was able to quote Shakespeare, "To be or not to be," and
Yes.
Ukraine had chosen to be, and referenced Churchill in terms of we'll fight them on the woods and in the fields and on the beaches. But it's not just Zelensky. It's I've often quoted on here, John, the Clausewitzian Trinity. So you've got this brilliant strategy bridge going on between the political intent and the military power between Zelensky and General Zelensky, and you've got the nation mobilized. And as I've also said many times, armies don't fight wars, nations fight wars. And it's that reason that they've also said it's the spirit of Ukraine.
Yeah.
So he is pivotal, but it's nations that fight wars, not one individual. But he has mobilized, like Churchill, the English language and sent it into battle.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned Churchill, which is a really, obviously a good example. And what was that quote from the Duke of Wellington about Napoleon? That his hat, or I guess the side of his hat on the battlefield, was worth 5 divisions, something like that. I guess you can't put a thing like that in a bottle or put it under a microscope on a microscope slide. But how do you analyze it? What is it? What is that X factor for a great commander?
Well, if you knew that, you could bottle it, and we'd all have one at the pinnacle of each government at the time. There are different demands at different levels at the tactical, strategic, and operational level. He's been that strategic leader with those three qualities which I've mentioned about character, competence, and communication. And it's really, for me, it came before that, because if you were looking at it, and I started really first studying this in detail with the Bow invasion of April 21. So from April 21, Zelensky had to manage an alert fatigue for the country and get the country mobilized for what might inevitably come. And that was a leadership task in itself. So he managed that very well in the same way that he's managing the situation at the moment. There's also another parallel with Churchill in terms of you need a distinctive mode of who you are. Churchill had his siren suit, and we've seen Zelensky with those green tops, which he could probably sell to anyone in the world at an auction for $1 million, because such is the magnitude of what he's brought to that country at the moment.
Yes, I mean, Zelensky's now, or has been, visiting the front line, his troops in the Donbass, which is going to be such an important front line during these coming winter months. And we talk now, pretty much all the time about the way the fighting is going to slow down for the winter. But what will the fighting look like over these months? Do you think, Chip?
Well, it's going to be attritional. No one's going to go very far. And I think the most significant thing here is what Avril Haines said last week. Now, Avril Haines is the director of national intelligence. That's really important in America because she is primus inter pares of the 18 parts of the intelligence community. Many people think the prime briefer to the president is a CIA, but it's not. It's Avril Haines of the Office of Director of National Intelligence. So, what did she really say, and why is that important? Firstly, the reduced tempo, so no one's going to go anywhere very fast. But she also said, which relates to our first point about Zelensky, that there's no reduction in Ukrainian will to resist and their morale hasn't failed. But as significantly, it was to do with the fact that the Russians have been firing 20,000 artillery rounds a day for the duration of the war, that they're short of these things. At the same time she was speaking, a guy called Doug Bush, who's the guy who does the procurement for the Americans, gave a speech about how the Americans are ramping up their artillery production and precision weapons in the next few years for the fact that this might be a long war where they will have the capacity to outproduce the Russians for the next 3 or 4 years if necessary. Now, that's obviously one of the scenarios that this will go on for a number of years. There is still the short war scenario that somewhere the Russians are more likely to collapse, the Russian army
Yeah.
or the Russian people, than the Ukrainian army because of that will to resist, which Zelensky has really given them.
Okay, last thought, Chip, away from the battlefield. The effect of sanctions on Russia's capability when it comes to fighting and waging this war. Is there an effect that you can clearly see? I was reading just today about the Russians in one report, the Russians preparing a fleet of oil tankers to sail, as it were, incognito to avoid sanctions. What are your thoughts?
I don't think that's that relevant in this sense. That I think it was John McCain who said a few years ago that Russia is an oil well with nukes masquerading as a country. The really key thing in terms of sanctions this week is Russia trying to go with a begging bowl to India, who they are providing oil to, with a requirement for 500 different types of metallurgic and industrial parts to keep their industries, car, automobile, anything which has metal parts and industrial parts going for the future. That is where they are really crippled. It's no good just having the ruble being increased against the dollar, which is an inevitable outcome if you're not importing anything. It's those real cripplers when you have a economy of 1.8 trillion against the West of 40 trillion. So if this does go on for a long time, and the West still keeps supporting Ukraine, which is really really important, then Russia will inevitably sort of collapse at some stage under its own weight.